humans have reached the bottom of the ocean and walked on the surface of the moon. We have split the atom, mapped the human genome, and built machines that can look back to the birth of the universe. But there is one place we still don't fully understand the ancient past beneath our own feet. Because scattered across Earth are structures that don't behave like early human attempts at building. They appear precise where they should be rough, deliberate where they should be experimental, and complete where they should still be evolving. Massive stones cut and placed with a level of control that doesn't match the tools we believe existed. Entire cities designed with systems drainage, alignment, structural balance that seem to emerge without any visible development phase. And the deeper we dig, the more the pattern repeats. No clear origin, no gradual improvement, no record of how knowledge moved from simple to advanced. It just appears, fully formed, then disappears. This is where the story of human progress begins to fracture. Because if humans truly built these, then something about how we understand our own past is still missing. A city where time may have been carved into stone, where defensive architecture behaves like a controlled system, and where the entire urban structure appears to have been deliberately shut down rather than destroyed. Hattusa is not just the former capital of the Hittite Empire. It is one of the few ancient sites that suggests a level of organized complexity so precise that even after extensive excavation, its true mode of operation remains unclear. Located in the highlands of central Anatolia, in what is now modern-day Turkey, Hattusa was rediscovered in the 19th century. In 1834, the French explorer Charles Texier first documented the vast ruins scattered across the landscape. But it was not until the early 20th century, through systematic excavations led by the German Archaeological Institute, that the full scale of the site began to emerge. What they uncovered was not merely a city, but the administrative and political core of a major Bronze Age power, one that rivaled Egypt and left behind written records confirming its reach and influence. Yet from the very beginning, Hattusa resisted behaving like a typical archaeological site. It does not offer a clean narrative of construction, occupation, and collapse. Instead, each layer of discovery reveals elements that can be explained in isolation, but together form a pattern that feels incomplete, as if the underlying logic that once connected them has been lost. Beyond its outer walls, the layout of Hattusa begins to challenge conventional expectations. More than 6 kilometers of fortification walls stretch across uneven terrain, not in straight lines or geometric symmetry, but in calculated alignment with the natural landscape. Gates such as the Lion Gate and the King's Gate are positioned not for convenience, but for control, forcing movement through narrow, predictable passages. The terrain itself is integrated into the defensive design, creating a network of vantage points and blind zones that suggests a deep understanding of spatial control. This is not a city optimized for comfort. It is a structure optimized to regulate movement. That sense of controlled design extends beneath the surface. At Yirkapa, a stone-built tunnel cuts through an artificial embankment, forming a narrow corridor roughly 70 meters in length. Constructed with carefully fitted stone blocks, it has remained structurally intact for millennia, and yet there is no clear evidence that it was used extensively. The interior lacks consistent wear patterns. There are no traces of soot from torches, and no accumulation indicating regular passage. It stands as a piece of infrastructure built with precision, but without an observable function suggesting a purpose that either left no trace or was never realized in a conventional way. A short distance away, Hattusa departs even further from the behavior of a typical city at the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya. Here, more than 90 carved figures, primarily deities, are arranged in ordered sequences along natural rock walls. They are not randomly placed, nor purely decorative. They follow structured patterns. Some modern interpretations propose that these sequences correspond to astronomical cycles, including lunar phases and solar movement. If this interpretation holds, Yazilikaya may not be simply a religious site, but a system for tracking time, one encoded directly into stone, requiring no moving mechanisms and no written explanation to function. Alongside its physical structures, Hattusa preserves an immense archive of information. Tens of thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform have been uncovered, documenting laws, rituals, diplomatic correspondence, and treaties, including one of the earliest known peace agreements in history. On the surface, such a volume of written material should make Hattusa one of the most transparent ancient civilizations. Instead, it introduces another layer of uncertainty. Portions of these texts remain only partially understood, and certain repetitive structures within them suggest formalized systems that have not been fully deciphered. The data exists, but the framework required to interpret it may be incomplete. This contradiction becomes even more striking when considered alongside the city's final phase. Around 1200 BCE, during a period when multiple late Bronze Age civilizations experienced disruption, Hattusa was abandoned. However, its end does not align neatly with the typical patterns of collapse. There is no single destructive layer indicating a final catastrophic event. Instead, the evidence points toward a controlled withdrawal. Some areas appear to have been deliberately cleared, while others were left untouched. It does not resemble a city overwhelmed by external forces. It resembles a system that ceased operation. Individually, each of these elements can be explained through conventional interpretations. Defensive walls serve military purposes. Tunnels may have had symbolic or limited use. Yazilikaya could represent religious expression. The tablets are administrative records. Abandonment is a known historical process, but when viewed together, a different pattern emerges. Hattusa begins to appear as an integrated structure composed of multiple layers. A defensive system regulating movement, a subterranean infrastructure of uncertain function, a possible timekeeping system embedded in stone, and a vast informational network recording its operations. Krylgan Kala is a perfectly circular structure, rising out of one of the most inhospitable regions of Central Asia, a design so precise and so deliberate that it seems less like a settlement and more like a system built to measure something unseen. Hidden deep within the deserts of Karakalpakstan in modern-day Uzbekistan, Krylgan Kala was first identified in the mid-20th century during Soviet archaeological surveys led by Sergei Tolstov, a discovery that immediately raised more questions than it answered. What emerged from the sand was not the remains of a typical city or fortress, but a structure defined by symmetry, isolation, and a level of geometric control that appears out of place for its time. Excavations revealed concentric walls, a dominant central tower, and evidence of ritual activity, yet no clear explanation of purpose. And it is from this point where discovery ends and explanation fails that the real mystery begins. In the barren silence of the Karakalpak Desert, far from trade routes, rivers, or any logic that explains human settlement, a perfect circle rises from the dust. Not a city, not a fortress, not a ruin shaped by chaos or time. Krylgan Kala appears instead as something deliberate, an imprint of intention so precise that it feels less like architecture and more like a calculation carved into the earth. At first glance, it seems simple. A central tower surrounded by concentric rings of walls, all constructed from sun-dried clay. But simplicity here is deceptive, because nothing about this structure behaves the way ancient construction should. It does not expand organically like a settlement. It does not adapt to terrain like a defensive stronghold. It does not respond to necessity. Instead, it obeys geometry. The outer walls form near-perfect circles, enclosing space not for habitation, but for separation. Each ring is positioned with a spacing that suggests measurement rather than improvisation. The central tower rises not as a watchpoint, but as an axis, an anchor around which everything else is arranged. If this were a fortress, it would be inefficient. If it were a city, it would be impractical. But if it were something else, something designed to align, to measure, to correspond, then suddenly the structure begins to make a different kind of sense. And that is where the first fracture in our understanding appears. Because structures built for survival prioritize irregularity. They bend to terrain, to threat, to convenience. Yet here, in an environment where survival would demand flexibility, someone chose perfection instead. Someone imposed order onto the desert with such rigidity that it defies the instinct of its own time. The question is not how it was built. The question is why anyone would build this at all. The central tower only deepens the mystery. Rising above the rings, it dominates the structure, but offers none of the advantages expected from height. It is not positioned to guard, nor to house, nor to store. Its placement is too exact, too central, too intentional. It behaves less like a building and more like a reference point, a fixed marker in a system that extends beyond the visible. Some have suggested it was an observatory, a primitive instrument for tracking celestial bodies, and the idea is not without merit. The circular design, the open sky, the elevated center, these are features that echo other ancient sites tied to astronomical observation. But unlike places such as Stonehenge, where alignments with solstices are clearly demonstrated, Krylgan Kala offers no straightforward confirmation. There are hints, patterns, suggestions of orientation, but nothing definitive. It is as if the knowledge that guided its construction has been erased, leaving behind only the structure itself, stripped of its explanation. This absence is not a minor detail. It is the core of the enigma. Civilizations that possessed advanced knowledge of the sky typically recorded it. They inscribed it into stone, encoded it into myths, preserved it through ritual. Here, there is silence. No inscriptions explaining purpose. No surviving tradition connecting the structure to a larger system of understanding. Only a form that implies intelligence, without the language that would make that intelligence legible. Krylgan Kala stands in a region that offers no obvious reason for its existence. No nearby population centers of sufficient scale. No evidence of sustained habitation that would justify such an ambitious construction. It is not integrated into a network. It is not part of a visible chain of development. It is alone. Because human architecture, especially at scale, is rarely solitary. It emerges from context economic, social, environmental. It serves communities. It reflects needs. Yet here, we find a structure that appears disconnected from all of those forces. It does not belong to a city. It does not defend a border. It does not anchor a civilization. It simply exists, as if its purpose lies elsewhere. The entire complex is built from clay, one of the most fragile materials available to ancient builders. Sun-dried bricks, vulnerable to erosion, to wind, to time itself. And yet, against all expectation, it has endured, not intact but persistent. Enough remains to reveal its design, its precision, its intent. The choice of material suggests impermanence. The survival of the structure suggests the opposite. This paradox echoes through every layer of the site. A simple material shaped into a complex form, a remote location housing a sophisticated design, a structure that resembles a tool but leaves no instructions for its use. One possibility is that Krylgan Kala was never meant to be understood in isolation, that it was part of a broader system, one that has not survived or has not yet been recognized. The central tower could have functioned as a marker, the rings as boundaries of measurement, the entire structure as a way of interacting with cycles far larger than human life. Not a building, but a mechanism. Not a place to live, but a place to observe, to calculate, to align. A calendar perhaps, but not the kind that marks days on a surface. A spatial calendar where time is encoded into distance, into position, into movement across a fixed geometry. A system where the sky is read not through instruments, but through architecture itself. If that is the case, then what we are looking at is not primitive at all. And abstraction leaves the weakest archaeological footprint, because when knowledge is embedded into form rather than text, when function is expressed through alignment rather than inscription, what remains after centuries is not explanation but structure, a shell of meaning without its language. This may be why Krylgan Kala resists interpretation, not because it is unknowable, but because we are searching for the wrong kind of evidence. We look for tools, for writings, for artifacts that confirm intention. But what if the intention was never meant to be recorded that way? What if the structure itself is the record, and so we are left standing at the edge of a system we cannot fully enter? We can map its walls, trace its circles, measure its symmetry, but the logic that binds it together remains just out of reach, visible in form, invisible in meaning. Most ancient structures answer questions about the past. They tell us who built them, why they were needed, how they were used. Krylgan Kala does something far more unsettling. It asks a question we are not yet equipped to answer. Kaman-Kalehöyük is not a lost city, not a buried empire, and not a single mystery waiting to be solved. It is something far more unsettling, a place where history appears to have been written, erased, and rewritten over and over again without memory. Located in central Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey, this archaeological mound rises quietly above the surrounding plains, giving no immediate indication of what lies beneath. First, systematically excavated in 1986 by Japanese archaeologist Sachihiro Omura and the Japanese Institute of Anatolian Archaeology, the site initially seemed like many others in the region, another settlement layered through time. But as excavation deepened, it became clear that this was not simply a record of continuous human occupation. It was a record of repeated beginnings. At the surface, the remains of familiar stone structures, fragments of pottery, traces of domestic life that resemble countless other settlements across Anatolia. But only a short distance below, the logic begins to fracture. The architecture changes abruptly, not gradually. Materials shift without transition. A layer of ash interrupts what should have been continuity, as if an entire world was erased in a single event. Beneath that, another settlement emerges, built with different priorities, different techniques, and, most disturbingly, no clear awareness of what lies just below its foundations. It is not evolution, it is replacement. As excavation continues downward, the illusion of progress collapses entirely. In one layer, evidence of early ironworking appears, tools and residues that suggest a level of metallurgical understanding that should mark a turning point in technological development. But the layer above it shows no continuation of that knowledge. The iron disappears, replaced by simpler materials, as if the skill itself had been lost rather than improved. Then, deeper still, metal reappears again, reintroduced as though rediscovered by people who had no inheritance of prior innovation. The pattern repeats in subtle variations, knowledge emerging, vanishing, and re-emerging without a clear line of transmission. This is where Kaman-Kalehöyük becomes something far more unsettling than a typical archaeological site. It suggests that human advancement is not cumulative. It suggests that entire systems of knowledge can exist, disappear, and return without leaving a continuous trace. The people living above these buried layers were not building upon the past, they were living above it, unaware of it, disconnected from it. Civilization, in this context, is not a ladder. It is a series of isolated attempts, each one starting closer to zero than we would expect. The physical evidence reinforces this disconnection. Pottery styles appear that resemble those found in other regions and periods, yet the methods used to create them differ. Tools are discovered in contexts where they do not fully belong, either too advanced for their surroundings or too primitive for the layers above. Some artifacts resist easy classification altogether, existing in a kind of chronological ambiguity that challenges the standard frameworks used to interpret them. These are not dramatic anomalies that demand sensational explanations. They are quiet inconsistencies, small fractures in the narrative that accumulate until the narrative itself can no longer hold. Then there are the signs of repeated destruction. Layers of collapse, fire, and abandonment mark the site at multiple depths. These are not isolated catastrophes, they are cycles. Each time, a settlement ends abruptly, sometimes violently, sometimes silently, and is eventually replaced by another. But what is missing is just as important as what is present. There is little evidence that the new inhabitants learned from the failures of the previous ones. Defensive structures are not consistently improved. Urban planning does not show a clear progression. It is as if each new phase begins without access to the memory of what came before. This absence of continuity raises a deeper question, one that extends beyond archaeology into something more existential. If knowledge can be lost so completely that it leaves no usable trace for those who come after, then how stable is the idea of progress itself? At Kaman-Kalehöyük, the past does not guide the future. It is buried beneath it, inaccessible, inert. The people who lived here were not part of a single unfolding story. They were participants in separate stories that happened to occupy the same physical space at different times. The site also challenges the way we think about time. On the surface, time feels linear, one moment leading to the next in a continuous flow. But here, time is layered. Standing in the excavation, a single step downward can represent centuries. A vertical wall of earth becomes a cross-section of human existence, each band of soil marking a different world. Moving through it is not like reading a history book. It is like flipping through disconnected fragments of multiple books that share no common narrative. The deeper you go, the less those fragments seem to belong to the same species, even though they all belong to us. What makes this even more unsettling is how familiar the pattern feels when removed from the context of ancient history. The fragility of knowledge is not confined to the past. Even now, complex systems exist that depend on continuity on the assumption that what we know today will be understood tomorrow. But Kaman-Kalehöyük suggests that this assumption may be far less reliable than we think. If entire technologies can vanish within a few generations, if entire cultural frameworks can be replaced without preserving what came before, then the stability of our own world becomes an open question. There is no single mystery at Kaman-Kalehöyük that can be solved with a definitive answer. There is no hidden chamber, no singular artifact that rewrites everything we know. Instead, the mystery is structural. It is embedded in the way the site behaves, in the way it refuses to align with the expectations we bring to it. It forces a shift in perspective from asking what happened here to asking why history itself appears so unstable. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of Kaman-Kalehöyük is not what it reveals about the past, but what it implies about us. The people who lived in each layer believed in their own time that they understood their world. They built, they adapted, they survived until they didn't. Then they were gone, and whatever they knew went with them. The next group arrived, and the process began again, disconnected from everything that had been buried beneath their feet. Dig deep enough into one place, and history stops behaving like a story. It becomes something else, entirely, something fragmented, recursive, and incomplete. And in that fragmentation lies a possibility that is difficult to ignore. That civilization is not a continuous ascent, but a repeating pattern of forgetting and rediscovery, played out over and over again, layer by layer, beneath the surface of the earth. Located in western Anatolia, along what was once a thriving coastline of the Aegean world, Miletus appears today as a silent inland ruin, far removed from the sea that once defined its existence. At first glance, nothing about it seems extraordinary stone remains. A collapsed harbour, fragments of a forgotten city. But beneath this stillness lies something far more unsettling. This was not merely a place of trade or architecture. It was the first place on Earth where human beings began to dismantle myth and replace it with reason, where reality itself was treated not as divine mystery, but as something that could be understood, questioned, and explained. The rediscovery of Miletus did not come through a single dramatic accident, but through gradual archaeological attention in the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly under the work of German excavations that began systematically uncovering the site. Layer by layer, what emerged was not just a city, but a pattern, streets arranged with intention, districts divided with logic, infrastructure that suggested planning far beyond what one would expect for its time. Yet even more striking than its physical structure was the intellectual legacy tied to it. A legacy that did not leave behind monuments, but something far less visible and far more permanent. Long before philosophy became formalized, before science had language to define itself, a figure known as Thales of Miletus stood in this city and proposed something deceptively simple, that everything in existence could be traced back to a single natural principle. Not the will of gods, not mythological narratives, but something observable. Water. The idea itself was primitive, even incorrect, but it marked a shift so profound that it altered the trajectory of human thought. For the first time, the world was approached not as a story to be believed, but as a system to be analysed. This way of thinking did not remain confined to one individual. It expanded through minds like Anaximander and Anaximenes, each pushing further into abstraction, further away from myth, constructing early frameworks for understanding the universe as governed by consistent principles. In Miletus, something irreversible had begun. The belief that reality itself could be decoded took root, and with it came a transformation that would echo far beyond the city's physical boundaries. But what makes Miletus particularly unsettling is not only what it thought, but how it existed. This was not a city that grew randomly over time. It was structured, organized, designed with an almost mathematical precision. The urban planner Hippodamus of Miletus introduced a grid system that divided the city into distinct functional zones: residential areas, marketplaces, civic spaces, imposing logic onto the physical environment itself. Movement within the city was anticipated. Space was controlled. Life was arranged according to an underlying order that mirrored the same rational principles being applied to the universe. In many ways, Miletus was not just a place where reality was studied, it was a place where reality was being reconstructed. The same mindset that sought to explain the cosmos was now shaping human society. The city became an early experiment in designing existence itself, reducing complexity into systems, turning unpredictability into structure. It was, in essence, a prototype of a rational world. In Sepramar, and yet, despite its intellectual dominance and its vast network of influence spanning dozens of colonies across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, Miletus contained within it a vulnerability it could not reason its way out of. It was positioned near the mouth of the Meander River, a river whose slow but relentless accumulation of sediment would gradually reshape the coastline. Over time, the harbour that had once connected Miletus to the wider world began to fill. There was no sudden disaster, no invasion, no singular moment of collapse. Instead, the process unfolded quietly. Ships struggled to reach the port, trade routes shifted elsewhere, Water gave way to marshland, and marshland eventually became solid ground. The sea, which had once defined the city's identity, did not retreat in a visible movement. It disappeared beneath layers of earth. What had once been a thriving maritime hub slowly became landlocked, isolated from the very system that had sustained it. This is where the story of Miletus diverges from the familiar narratives of ancient collapse. It did not fall, it diminished. It was not destroyed, it was rendered irrelevant. Its decline was not marked by catastrophe, but by gradual disconnection. The people who lived there likely did not experience a clear ending, only a slow realization that the world around them was changing in ways they could neither control nor reverse. There is a profound irony embedded in this transformation. The city that gave birth to rational inquiry, that taught humanity to observe and interpret the natural world, ultimately succumbed to that same world. Its inhabitants could study patterns, propose explanations, and develop theories, but they could not alter the forces shaping their environment. Knowledge, it turned out, did not equate to control. Understanding did not ensure survival. Today, what remains of Miletus is a landscape of ruins. Stone theatres that once held audiences, streets that once carried the flow of daily life, structures that hint at a system long gone, but the most striking absence is the sea. Standing there now, the silence feels disproportionate to the city's former significance. A place that once connected vast regions through trade and ideas now exists in isolation, cut off from the very element that once defined it. And yet, in another sense, Miletus never truly disappeared. Its physical presence may have faded, but its intellectual legacy did not. The ideas that originated there continued to move, to evolve, to embed themselves in other civilizations. They influenced Athens, shaped the development of Roman thought, and ultimately became foundational to the modern understanding of science and philosophy. The assumption that the universe operates according to discoverable laws, the very basis of how we interpret reality today, can be traced back, in part, to this city. This is what makes Miletus deeply unsettling. It presents a paradox that remains relevant. A civilization can achieve intellectual breakthroughs that redefine humanity's understanding of existence, can build systems that outlast empires, and still vanish without resistance. Not through failure, but through irrelevance. Not because it lacked knowledge, but because knowledge alone could not preserve it. Miletus leaves behind a question that lingers far beyond its ruins. If a place that understood the world more deeply than any before it could still be erased so quietly, then what exactly does understanding protect us from? And if the foundations of our own world originate from a city that no longer matters, then how permanent is anything we are building now? Somewhere within the silence of its abandoned structures, within the empty theatre facing a landscape that was once the sea, there is an answer not written, not spoken, but implied. A reminder that the most transformative shift in human history did not come through conquest or construction, but through thought, and that even the place where that thought was born could not escape the reality it sought to understand. High above the plains of ancient Korea, carved into a granite mountainside where no city should exist, Labraunda stands as a place that was never meant for living, only for transformation. It is a sanctuary where every stone, every step, and every symbol appears to have been designed not to house people, but to alter them. Nothing about its location is practical. Nothing about its construction is efficient. And yet it functioned for centuries as one of the most important religious centers in the region. That contradiction is not a flaw. It is the first clue. Labraunda lies deep within the mountains of what is now southwestern Turkey, far from the fertile lands that sustained the ancient city of Mylasa below. The sanctuary is connected to the city by a long ascending sacred road that winds through rough terrain, climbing steadily toward a place that offers neither comfort nor survival advantage. Ancient writers knew of its existence, but its full structure remained hidden for centuries, partially buried, partially collapsed into the mountain itself. It was not until systematic excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries that its terraces, temples, and ceremonial buildings were gradually revealed, layer by layer, exposing not just a religious site, but a carefully constructed environment. At first glance, what emerged seemed familiar. A temple dedicated to Zeus Labraundos, surrounded by supporting structures typical of ancient sanctuaries, but almost immediately, inconsistencies began to appear. The god worshipped here did not conform to the classical image of Zeus. Instead of holding a thunderbolt, he carried a double-headed axe, the Labris, an object whose origins trace back to cultures older than Greece itself, associated with ritual power, sacrifice, and a more archaic form of authority. This was not simply Zeus as the Greeks understood him. It was something layered, something adapted, something that suggested an older belief system had not been erased, but absorbed. The deeper archaeologists looked, the more the site resisted simple explanation. Labraunda was not a settlement. There is no evidence that people lived here permanently. There are no signs of agriculture sufficient to sustain a population, no infrastructure designed for everyday life. Everything points to a different purpose, one that required people to arrive, participate, and leave. The sanctuary was not a place to exist. It was a place to undergo something, and that something begins long before the temple itself. The road from Miletus to Labraunda is not just a connection between 2 points, it is a process. Stretching across difficult terrain and rising steadily in elevation, it forces those who travel it into a state of physical strain. The climb is relentless. The environment grows quieter, more isolated, more detached from the rhythms of ordinary life. By the time the sanctuary comes into view, framed against stone and sky, the journey has already begun to reshape perception. Fatigue sets in, breathing changes. The body becomes aware of itself in ways it normally is not. By the time they arrived, the people were different. Nothing about the design of Labraunda suggests coincidence. The terraces that define the site are arranged in a vertical sequence, each level leading upward, restricting movement into a controlled path. There are no wide open spaces that allow for free wandering. Instead, the architecture channels individuals through a progression, one that feels less like navigation and more like instruction. To reach the highest point, one must pass through each stage below, physically enacting a transition from one level to another. It is here that the sanctuary begins to reveal its true nature. Modern interpretations often describe ancient religious sites as places where humans went to encounter the divine. Labraunda suggests something more deliberate and more unsettling. The combination of physical exhaustion, elevation, isolation, and ritual repetition creates conditions that alter human perception. These are not random environmental effects. They are predictable responses. Fatigue blurs the boundary between sensation and emotion. Height affects balance and awareness. Silence amplifies internal thought. Together, they create a mental state in which expectation can become experience. What happens next does not require a god to appear. The sanctuary completes the process. Within its controlled spaces, temples, terraces, and ritual halls, participants, already transformed by the journey, are exposed to symbols, ceremonies, and shared narratives that reinforce a single idea, that they have crossed a boundary, that they are no longer in the ordinary world, that something greater is present, and to them it would have been real. The engineering of Labraunda operates on a level that extends beyond construction. The massive stone blocks used to build its terraces were transported up terrain that offers no easy explanation for efficiency. The builders did not minimize effort, they amplified it. Every decision from location to layout prioritizes intensity over convenience. This is not architecture designed to solve problems. It is architecture designed to create impact. Difficulty, in this context, is not a limitation. It is a tool. The harder it is to reach a place, the more significant that place feels once it is attained. Labraunda embeds this principle into its very structure. The mountain is not an obstacle to overcome, it is part of the experience itself. Every step upward increases the psychological weight of arrival, making whatever happens at the summit feel inevitable, meaningful, and beyond ordinary explanation. Even the communal spaces, such as the androns where ritual feasting took place, are part of this system. These were not casual gatherings. They were controlled environments where individuals, already altered by the journey, were brought together under shared symbols and collective belief. Food, ritual, and architecture converge to reinforce the same conclusion, that an encounter with the divine has occurred. But the most unsettling possibility is not that gods descended here, it is that they never needed to. Because everything about Labraunda, its remote location, its demanding ascent, its layered architecture, its archaic symbols works together to produce the sensation of divine presence without requiring any external force. The system is complete. It does not depend on a god to manifest. It depends on human perception to respond, and human perception, under the right conditions, will. This does not diminish the experiences of those who came here. If anything, it makes them more profound. The emotions they felt, the visions they may have seen, the certainty that they had touched something beyond themselves, these were real, but their origin may not lie in the heavens. It may lie in the mountain itself, in the deliberate shaping of environment and experience, in an ancient understanding that belief can be guided, intensified, and ultimately created. Aigai is a city that seems to exist without a reason, built far from major trade routes, isolated in rugged mountains, and lacking the advantages that define most ancient urban centres. It still developed a full civic identity, complete with a monumental agora, administrative buildings, and temples that suggest a level of planning far beyond what its location should justify. Nothing about where it stands explains why it was ever built, and yet its ruins reveal a place that was not only inhabited, but carefully designed. Located in the region of Aeolis, in what is now western Turkey, Aigai lies deep within a mountainous landscape that offers little in terms of agricultural abundance or strategic control over major routes. Unlike coastal cities that thrived on maritime trade, or inland hubs positioned along critical corridors, Aigai occupies terrain that appears inconvenient at best. The hills are steep, the land is uneven, and access is limited. It is the kind of place civilizations typically avoid when building something meant to last. The site was first identified in modern times through scattered references and later confirmed by archaeological surveys that began in the 19th century, when explorers and scholars started documenting ancient settlements across Anatolia. What they found at Aigai was not the remains of a minor village, but the structured outline of a fully realized city. Excavations revealed an organized urban plan, with stone-built structures arranged deliberately across terraces cut into the mountainside. Each discovery added clarity to the physical layout, but not to the reason behind it. At the center of Aigai stands an expansive agora, framed by stoas that once sheltered public gatherings and civic activity. Nearby, the remains of a bouleuterion indicate a functioning political system, a place where decisions were debated and authority was exercised. A temple dedicated to Athena anchors the spiritual dimension of the city, linking it to the broader traditions of the ancient Greek world. Every essential component of an urban center is present, and each has been constructed with a level of care that implies long-term intention. But the deeper the city is examined, the less its existence aligns with the expectations of ancient logic. Cities were not built arbitrarily. Petra emerged because it controlled trade flowing through desert routes. turning isolation into advantage. Machu Picchu occupied a remote mountain ridge, but served a defined imperial and ceremonial function within the Inca state. Even settlements in difficult environments typically reveal a clear purpose when studied closely. Aigai, by contrast, offers fragments of explanation but never a complete answer. The scale of its architecture exceeds what its environment would seem to support. The presence of civic institutions suggests a population that required organization and governance, yet the surrounding terrain does not indicate the kind of economic base that would sustain such complexity. It is as if the city was built not because it needed to exist, but because someone decided that it should. Among the details that persist across the ruins, one element stands out with unusual consistency: the image of the goat. The very name Aigai derives from the Greek word for goat, and throughout the site, this symbol appears repeatedly in carvings and decorative fragments. In many ancient cultures, animal imagery reinforces familiar mythologies, serving as shorthand for power, divinity, or protection. Here, however, the repetition feels different. It does not simply decorate, it emphasizes. The goat occupies a unique position in ancient symbolic systems, associated with fertility, sacrifice, and the untamed aspects of nature. It often appears in contexts that blur the line between ritual and survival. Its presence in Aigai is not isolated or incidental. It is embedded into the identity of the place itself, and in architecture, repetition of this kind rarely exists without intention. That raises a possibility that reshapes the entire interpretation of the city. If Aigai was not constructed purely as a functional settlement, but as a space that also served ritual or symbolic purposes, then its apparent contradictions begin to align. The remote location becomes less of a disadvantage and more of a requirement. Isolation allows for activities that are not meant to be integrated into everyday life. The scale of the agora and surrounding structures may not reflect daily use, but periodic gatherings, events that required preparation, space, and permanence. In this context, Aigai begins to resemble something more than a city. It becomes a stage, not for commerce, not for defense, but for repetition for acts that carried meaning beyond immediate survival. A place where architecture was not only about shelter or governance, a place but about hosting something intangible, something that required physical form to exist. And yet, if that were its purpose, it leaves behind a critical absence. There are no clear historical records that explain such a function. Aigai appears in the broader narrative of the Aeolian world, but only faintly. It never rises to prominence, never dominates regional history, never defines an era. It exists, participates, and then recedes. Its presence is acknowledged, but never fully described. This ambiguity extends to its decline. Unlike cities that fell to war or disaster, Aigai shows no evidence of sudden destruction. There are no burn layers, no mass graves, no signs of violent collapse. Instead, the pattern is gradual. Occupation diminishes, structures are left standing. Activity fades until the city is no longer maintained. It is not the story of a dramatic end, but of a quiet withdrawal. The inhabitants did not abandon Aigai in panic. They left over time, step by step, without erasing what they had built. This kind of disappearance is more difficult to interpret than catastrophe. War leaves traces, disaster leaves scars, but a slow departure leaves very little behind. What remains is a city that was built with intention, organized with care, and marked with symbols that suggest meaning beyond the practical, only to be set aside without clear explanation, as if whatever purpose it once served had simply concluded. Standing within its ruins today, nothing appears technologically impossible. The stones are within the capabilities of ancient builders. The layout, while unusual, follows understandable principles, There is no need to invoke lost knowledge or advanced techniques. And yet, the overall composition resists simplification. Hidden beneath the earth at Yinxu lies one of the most unsettling archaeological sites ever uncovered, a place where humans did not simply worship their ancestors, but believed they could communicate with the dead to govern an entire civilization. This was not myth. It was a functioning system, one that left behind thousands of written records carved into bone, tens of thousands of sacrificed bodies, and a model of reality that we still struggle to fully comprehend. Yinxu is located near modern-day Anyang in Henan Province, China, and was once the final capital of the Shang dynasty more than 3,000 years ago. But what makes this site extraordinary is not just its scale or age, it is the way it was rediscovered. In the late 19th century, fragments of so-called dragon bones were being sold in traditional medicine shops, ground into powder and consumed as remedies. They were disappearing unnoticed, reduced to dust, until one scholar recognized that these bones carried inscriptions, symbols unlike any known writing at the time. What had been treated as medicine suddenly became evidence, and that evidence led to the excavation of an entire lost civilization. When systematic digs began in the early 20th century, Yinxu emerged not as a simple ruin, but as a fully organized system. Palaces, temples, bronze workshops, and, most disturbingly, vast pits filled with human remains. But at the center of everything were the oracle bones, scapulae of oxen and plastrons of turtles, carefully prepared, deliberately heated until they cracked. These were not random ritual objects. They were records. Each one preserved a question addressed to an ancestor, the pattern of cracks interpreted as an answer, and, crucially, the outcome that followed. Not just belief but verification. This introduces an immediate paradox. What appears on the surface as primitive divination begins to resemble something far more structured. Shang kings did not rule through instinct alone, nor solely through human counsel. They governed through continuous consultation with the dead. Hunting expeditions, military campaigns, agricultural cycles, childbirth, every critical decision was filtered through this process. Fire, bone, interpretation, and record. Again and again. What we are looking at is not superstition in its simplest form, but a system that integrated the unseen into political reality. And then come the bodies, thousands of them. Excavations at Yinxu have revealed over 13,000 human skeletons, many of them decapitated, bound, or arranged in deliberate configurations. These were not casualties left behind by war. They were selected deaths. Organized, repeated, institutionalized. Entire groups buried together, often without grave goods, stripped of identity and reduced to function. They were not honored as individuals. They were used as components. What makes this deeply unsettling is not only the scale, but the consistency. Oracle bone inscriptions refer to sacrifice as routine. Questions were asked about how many individuals should be offered, whether the ancestors would accept the sacrifice, whether the ritual would bring success. The implication is difficult to avoid. Human life was part of a system, a resource to be acquired, allocated, and consumed according to a logic that linked the living to the dead. Within this framework, war takes on a different meaning. The Shang fought frequently, but their records do not frame conflict purely in terms of territory or defense. They track captives, they anticipate numbers, they evaluate success not only by victory, but by how many people could be brought back. Those captives were not merely prisoners, they were inputs. The battlefield becomes an extension of the ritual system, a place where future sacrifices are gathered. Violence was not a breakdown of order, it was supply. Yet for all its brutality, this civilization was not chaotic, it was highly structured. The writing system preserved on these oracle bones, the earliest known form of Chinese script, does not appear in a primitive state. It is already complex, consistent, and capable of expressing layered meaning. There is no clear archaeological trace of its developmental phase, no gradual evolution visible in the record. By the time we encounter it, it is already mature. This absence raises a critical question. Where is the missing history? Because what survives suggests something more than ritual. It suggests a way of thinking. The oracle bones are not just artifacts of belief, they are records of interaction, a system in which information is extracted, interpreted, and tested through repeated cycles. Stripped of its supernatural framing, it begins to resemble a decision-making architecture, primitive in material, perhaps, but not necessarily in design. At the center of this system stood the king. He was not only a political ruler, but the sole mediator between worlds. Authority did not come from law alone, nor from lineage alone, but from access. The ability to communicate with ancestors was centralized. The king asked the questions, the king received the answers, the king determined their meaning. Power, therefore, was inseparable from interpretation. To rule was to define reality itself, based on signals no one else could independently verify. Such a system creates its own stability. As long as it is believed, it reinforces itself. Success confirms the ancestors. Failure can be reframed as error in interpretation. There is no internal mechanism to dismantle it, because its foundation is not empirical, it is relational, a continuous link between the living and the dead. Until that link breaks. Around 1046 BCE, the Shang dynasty collapsed, overthrown by the Zhou. What is striking is not just the fall, but its abruptness. The elaborate oracle system disappears. Large-scale human sacrifice declines. A civilization that once relied entirely on communication with ancestors is replaced by one that redefines the concept of divine authority in entirely different terms. There is no gradual transition. It is as if the underlying logic itself was rejected, which leads to an unsettling possibility. What if Yinxu does not represent a primitive stage of human development, but an alternative one? A path in which information was not derived solely from observation, but from structured interaction with an unseen layer of reality, where data was not numerical, but physical cracks in bone, where decisions were not justified through evidence, but through continuity with the past. From a modern perspective, it is easy to dismiss this as superstition, but the scale, consistency, and integration of the system suggests something more disciplined than blind belief. A civilization may have existed, not just developed, but reached a level of complexity far beyond expectations, while leaving almost no trace in recorded history. Konar Sandal stands out not because of its visible scale or monumental dominance, but because of a contradiction. What has been uncovered here does not seem to belong to its time. The artifacts display precision, structure, and symbolic intent that feel out of place in the early stages of civilization. And the most unsettling detail is not that they exist, but that they were found in a place no one was even looking. Konar Sandal lies near the Jiroft region in southeastern Iran, in a landscape that for decades appeared ordinary, offering no clear signs of a major ancient center. There were no towering ruins on the surface, no historical references pointing to its importance, no reason to suspect that this region once held anything significant, until nature intervened. In the early 2000s, a sudden flood swept across the area, disrupting layers of sediment that had remained undisturbed for thousands of years. The ground fractured, exposing objects that did not belong to the present surface. Not scattered fragments, but an overwhelming number of artifacts emerging almost simultaneously. The first people to encounter them were not archaeologists, but looters. They quickly recognized the value of what had been revealed and began extracting objects before any scientific excavation could take place. Thousands of artifacts were removed and dispersed into the global black market, fragmenting the story before it could even be understood. What remained and what was later excavated under controlled conditions introduced a level of complexity that continues to challenge explanation. Chlorite vessels carved with extraordinary detail, covered in dense geometric patterns and composite figures, suggest a level of control and planning that goes beyond simple decoration. Lines repeat with minimal deviation. Forms interlock with intention. The carvings feel less like individual artistic expression and more like the output of a standardized system. This is not primitive art. It resembles a structured visual language. The issue is not the existence of such craftsmanship, but its timing. During the same period, many other regions of the world were only beginning to organize into complex societies. In Mesopotamia, symbolic systems were still evolving into writing, often inconsistent and experimental. Yet here, at Konar Sandal, the visual forms appear stabilized, as if they had already passed through earlier stages of development that are now missing. It does not look like the beginning of something. It looks like the continuation of something we have not seen. The discovery of clay tablets bearing undeciphered markings deepens the mystery further. These signs do not align with cuneiform, nor do they correspond to known systems from neighboring civilizations such as Elam. They exist in isolation, without a clear linguistic bridge. This raises the possibility that Konar Sandal was not merely a cultural center, but a place where symbolic communication may have developed independently, following a path that diverged entirely from the systems we recognize today. The architecture adds another layer of uncertainty. A large stepped structure has been identified at the site, often compared to Mesopotamian ziggurats, but the similarities are superficial. The proportions differ. The layout does not fully match known architectural conventions. More importantly, there is no textual evidence acknowledging its existence. A structure of this scale should have appeared in trade networks, records, or external references, but it does not. It stands outside the documented framework of the ancient world. There is also no clear evidence of violent destruction. No widespread burn layers, no signs of siege or sudden collapse. Instead, the site suggests a gradual abandonment. Systems ceased to function. Structures were left behind. Over time, they were buried beneath layers of earth, not as the result of catastrophe, but through slow disintegration. A civilization may have reached a considerable level of development, only to fade without leaving a clear explanation for its disappearance. Various theories attempt to account for this environmental stress: shifting water systems, migration of populations. Each offers a partial explanation, but none fully accounts for the sophistication of what remains. Societies capable of producing structured artifacts and possible symbolic systems typically leave behind clearer traces of transition. The absence of such evidence makes Konar Sandal difficult to categorize within known historical patterns. This leads to a broader and more unsettling possibility that the framework we use to understand early civilization may be incomplete. History is not a full record of everything that happened. It is a record of what survived. Narratives are built around those survivals, often assuming continuity where there may have been fragmentation. The rise of civilization is usually described as a linear progression from simple to complex, from isolated to organized, from silence to literacy. But what if that progression is only an illusion created by gaps in the record? What if complexity emerged multiple times, in multiple locations, under different conditions, and most of those developments failed, leaving behind fragments that do not fit into the dominant narrative? Konar Sandal may represent one of those fragments, not a clear origin, not a final stage, but an interruption, a signal from a version of the past that did not fully carry forward into the present. The artifacts do not explain themselves. The markings remain unread. The structures resist easy comparison. and the more closely they are examined, the more they seem to exist outside the categories used to define early civilization. Attempting to force them into an existing narrative may preserve the comfort of the timeline, but it does little to address the implications of the evidence. Because if Konar Sandal represents a truly independent center of complexity, then human history may not be a single path, but a landscape of many paths, most of which have been lost. And perhaps the most unsettling detail of all is how it was discovered, not through deliberate search, but through accident, a flood, a disruption, a moment when the ground could no longer conceal what lay beneath, which suggests something even more difficult to ignore. There may be other places like this, other systems. Quote, other civilizations that developed, reached complexity, and disappeared so completely that they left no recognizable trace waiting beneath the surface, indistinguishable from the land until something forces them into view.